I think I'm just going to say a couple of words about what life was like 10 years ago. And seeing all the young faces, I think if you think back 10 years, some of you might have been in secondary school and perhaps not imagining a future doing impact evaluation or any kind of work like this. And then maybe some of you will remember the things that I'm about to say about what the world was like 10 years ago. And this is a bit of a stylized version, but in those days, if you were working in a development agency like the World Bank, or I dare say the Department for International Development, certainly USAID, or you were in a government, really in any part of the world, but certainly in a low or middle income country, and somebody asked you whether the program that the government was funding or that the donor agency was funding was working, I think the response that you would likely get is, oh, well, we spent the money on time and not much of it got taken up by through corruption. Maybe people would say none of it. We did all the, we had all the workshops we planned to have. We trained all the people we had planned on training. We built all the buildings, all the schools. We bought the textbooks. I think that's what you would hear if somebody asked, is that working? Is that development program working? What you would be very unlikely to hear is, yes, we know it's working because we did a rigorous evaluation and we can see that the impacts that were expected on people's health, well-being, livelihoods, educational outcomes, that those have been achieved. It would be very, very rare for you to hear that. And so, and if you attempted to kind of look across the body of evidence and draw out lessons for the design of development programs, you would again sort of come up empty and only be able to say, well, we have some suggestive evidence from a couple of places, but really we don't know. That's what the world was like 10 years ago, and it has really changed in very, very dramatic ways. Maybe the most dramatic is that the answer to that question of, is it working, people really want to know and expect to know whether a given program is having the impact that is expected. It's also changed because, as Manny said, there are, thanks to the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation and many, many other efforts, there's a real body of evidence around many key interventions and sectors. And increasingly that information is being summarized so that we can see patterns across different contexts. So that is, really a pretty remarkable change in a relatively short period of time, especially considering that it takes time to do the kinds of rigorous studies that yield that evidence. And there are still lots and lots of challenges. Just to highlight a few out of many. I think what we've seen also over the past 10 years is a lot of contestation over methods and competition among people who believe that the world can be understood in different ways. There has been a realization of how vulnerable the funding for evaluation and research is. When I worked with colleagues on the original design of 3IE, we imagined that because it was generating public goods, there would be a kind of taxation, if you will, of development agencies, and that there would be an ongoing flow of resources. That was a dream that has not been realized. We also underestimated how difficult it would be to get the evidence that is being generated used in a systematic way and through regular routine processes, either in development agencies or in governments. And we also, I think, a challenge that has emerged, as well as an opportunity, is around moving the locus of evaluation from northern and particularly academic northern institutions into southern research-oriented organizations. And finally, I'll say as a challenge, and Manny alluded to this a little bit, is that we've seen, particularly in the past few years, a real closing of space for independent analysis. There are real challenges throughout the world to the work of people and institutions who are generating knowledge that is sometimes uncomfortable for governments. So with that sort of both optimistic and sober introduction, let me say that we're going to have a conversation with some terrific panelists over the next 45 minutes or so. And I'm really, really pleased to be able to lead that discussion or pose the questions. So let me introduce the panelists in the order in which I'll ask them questions. Then they're going to give brief responses. We'll go back and forth a little bit. You can imagine that we're in a kind of chat show, even though we're in a more formal venue. And then I'll give the chance to the panelists to say a few closing words. So first, let me welcome Alastair Ager, who is the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer at the UK Department for International Development, your very own aid agency. He is, in addition to being the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer, he's a professor and the director of the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University, and has worked in the field of global health and development for at least 25 years. Maybe that needs to be updated.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It needs to be a little bit longer.
Yeah. What's the real number?
33.
33. We're going to update his bio. Okay. Then I'm also delighted to have with me here Adeline Sibanda, who is the president of the African Evaluation Association. She'll tell us a little bit more about AFREA, as it is known. She's also the president of the International Organization for Cooperation in Evaluation, so clearly spends a lot of her time working on this enabling environment for good and useful evaluation. She's the founder and managing director of ADISIM Developments, which is a consultancy service, and has, now I'm going to test you on this, 26 years of experience in the development field. Would you like to update that number? Is that right?
That's correct.
That's correct, okay. And has just vast experience undertaking evaluations of many kinds. Finally, I'm going to be pleased to have a chance to speak with my friend Howard White, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Campbell Collaboration. He was the founding executive director of 3IE, and before that led impact evaluation efforts at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. He's an academic who cares a lot about the policy relevance of evidence and is an indefatigable champion for impact evaluation and synthesis. Okay, so let's, what?
33.
Oh, 33, I didn't, it's not on here, 33 years, okay. So you can see we haven't accumulated more than a century of experience, so. Yeah, okay. So let's start the conversation. Alastair, so say a little bit about what your role is. Chief Scientific Advisor, Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor doesn't exactly tell us everything we need to know, so just say a few words about that, and then maybe give us some inside information, kind of off the record, about how the Department for International Development overall sets priorities, kind of substantive, sectoral, substantive, geographic, and then where does research and evaluation come into play, and how does it set priorities for research and evaluation? I know those are big questions. Feel free to give us some stories if you have them.
Well, I'll start with some structural things. We were talking a bit earlier about complex organizational structures and things. So if I start with explaining my role, deputy, so I'm Charlotte's deputy. Charlotte Watt's a good friend of 3IE. If you actually see her picture on the back of the advert for the presentation this evening. She sends her best wishes from Nepal, where she's involved in the work of DFID, looking at evaluation of programming or evidence informing that programming. So I support and work with Charlotte. Scientific advisors are secondees. That's why my academic affiliation is in there, in the same way that Charlotte still holds an academic affiliation at the London School. And we see that as really valuable, that we're not career civil servants. So hugely valuable contribution that our colleagues who are career civil servants make. But having scientists in with a track record of however many years it is a perspective into policy making as well as research commissioning. So perhaps we'll separate those two a little, because as Chief Scientific Advisor and Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor, we do hold a role as a Director and Deputy Director of the Research and Evidence Division, which not surprisingly does stuff about research and evidence. But as Scientific Advisors, then we can contribute to discussions across DFID as a whole. So you set up to me just a little bit about how we set priorities. I think it's worth giving an idea that DFID seeks to be both a country-led, ground-led and strategically informed globally institution, so that the mechanisms of doing that is that over the summer each DFID office, country office, was developing a country development diagnostic, trying to understand the local issues that would define programming in the coming spending review period, reflecting on the local context, but doing so in the light of various policies and strategies that DFID has in place. And what informs those is a broad horizon scanning activity. DFID been quite active in the last couple of years, looking at coming trends and adjusting strategy towards that. I particularly hold a responsibility for looking at the growing role of technology in development, not just in terms of how we do development, but how technology is impacting the context in which we're working. And so the priorities then emerge through that, a process of melding together local priorities, regional priorities coming from country offices, and then in terms of broader strategic direction in terms of key areas of work. And then just a very concrete detail, some will be very familiar with this. Ultimately, any piece of DFID work becomes a business case. And that's a good opportunity for me just to link into the Research and Evidence Division. So a business case is, depending on the value of it, but likely approved by ministers. And there is a mandate within that business case of what we're going to do to say, well, what are the results we anticipate from that? And for a number of years now, there is a major section of that business case, which is what is the evidence base informing this, what is the theory of change, and what are the mechanisms put in place to adjust that theory of change in a regular way. So one of my jobs as a deputy director is that I have 97, I think, annual reviews, so programs that we're engaged in largely commissioning research, that I look at on an annual basis and see how things are going in terms of what was predicted to happen, and very much fitting in with your understanding of, rather than expecting a vague, well, it's going quite well, these are the outputs that we've been engaged in, beginning to understand whether the outcomes and the impact that we were seeking over time are being met. So the Research and Evidence Division is about a little over 100 people, working across research commissioning, working across evidence collation and evidence into action, and working across evaluation. And that is a group of staff very much embedded within the way that we're thinking within DFID, that seeks to identify areas where there is a strong evidence base to support programming, but also implicit in your question to identify areas where there is a weak evidence base, and then we might do some work around commissioning to fill those gaps.
Yeah. Great. And let me just ask one follow-up question. It sounds like you're largely commissioning research and evaluation to feed into DFID's own decision-making. Do you also see a role as contributing to kind of the sort of the public goods role?
Now, very much, and I suppose in a sense, because of the way you asked the question, I wanted to show that linkage between programming and our research, but you're absolutely right that we very much see, I was going to say it's almost a false dichotomy, but we very much see a role of commissioning research, which is a global public good. And so much of our investments in health and in agriculture, for example, including some stuff through 3IE, may be picked up by DFID programs, and in a sense it would be a little odd if it wasn't. But the idea is that it's creating evidence around agri-tech effectiveness or in terms of risk management in the agriculture sector, for example, to mention some of the 3IE work, which will be picked up as a global public good by other agencies or by other national governments. And we see that, and we make this case to ministers, and ministers are largely appreciative. That's a good development mechanism. That's an effective way that doesn't involve a DFID programming response to actually contribute that and to drive gain. But there is a balance to that, which is, as I say, it would be a little odd if the evidence that we were commissioning and creating that we think is of global value was not picked up by our agency. And so how are we using this evidence in our programming? And so that is a consideration which I should mention, as there's some colleagues here linked to our evidence department that are involved in the development of regional hubs where we try to embed our understanding of the evidence base that should inform programming, but also the challenges for implementation that need research synthesis or perhaps need research commissioning, actually coming from colleagues working currently in East Africa or South Asia. Those are the two hubs, but the potential for developing beyond that so that we're not Whitehall or Abercrombie House driven. There's a real sense that the issues that are coming up in the field can influence the research commissioning role.
Great. Well, that is the perfect, thanks for that. It's the perfect kind of transition to speak with Adeline about, you have a very special perspective as an evaluator from the African region and as the president of AFRIA. Maybe you could kind of say a few words about how you see the way funders, whether it's the Department for International Development or others, are they supporting the kinds of evaluation priorities that you see from your perspective? Are they doing it the right way?
Thanks, Ruth. Maybe just to start by congratulating 3IE for turning 10. Congratulations. And I'll also, if you allow me, start by introducing AFRIA, because I think it's important that you all know what the African Evaluation Association is all about. I'll take 30 seconds to do that. So AFRIA, it was established in 1999 as an umbrella body for national evaluation associations. We started off with 6 national evaluation associations, and as we turn 20 in 2019, we will have 45 national evaluation associations. And those are our members. But the national evaluation associations have members that constitute of professional evaluators, commissioners of evaluations, policymakers, governments, public and development practitioners. So I think it's important to see that, that representation within our associations. And what is our vision? As AFRIA, really our vision is an Africa rooted in a culture of evaluation for equitable and sustainable development. And really, our mandate right from the start was evaluation capacity development. And we started doing that by making sure that we've established national evaluation associations at national level. And we believe that we've done a great job in doing that in the past 20 years. Now our focus is on individual capacity strengthening, institutional capacity strengthening, supporting governments in national evaluation systems, and so forth. I can go on and on. And one thing that most people know about is our African Evaluation Association conferences that we hold every 2 years, and the next one will be in Abidjan in 2019. Now, to answer to your question, okay. Ruth, I had forgot. I needed to make sure that we are all on the same level. So, my short answer is no. My long answer.
Do go on.
My long answer is that, in my lifetime, which is quite long, I've seen quite a lot of development programs that have taken place, but without a real development. So the question that I ask myself is why? Yeah? So I think we talk about evidence, but it's not for the sake of evidence. We want that evidence that is produced to be used to make policy decisions that affect development and sustainable development that make a difference in the lives of the poor people. And I think that is key. And I think very often we end up focusing on evidence and not saying, why do we need this evidence? And so for me, that is the first focus that I want to bring. So I've seen so many, development strategies being introduced by different organizations, and yet they leave the people that are supposed to be helped poorer than they were without an apology. As you mentioned, Ruth, in your introduction, you mentioned that really, if the global evaluation ecosystem has been driven largely from the North, and the Global South has not had much of a say or a recognition in terms of their participation. So as I give my response as somebody coming from Africa who's doing the evaluations, but also somebody who's relating with other global associations from the Global North, from the Global South, working with the Global North. And I'm hoping that some of these things will come out later with Gonzalo in the session that you'll give on Mexico, because we are working with some of his colleagues. So the decisions, so having said that, decisions about what is evaluated and who evaluates and how it is evaluated is mainly made by the commissioners, who are mainly those who provide resources in the Global South. And so they call the shots, so they hold the power. And I think very often we say evaluation is neutral. No, it's not. It's about power relations. And where does the power reside? So that's the question for me that we need to be asking. And it's very important for us to address those issues around the power relations. So as I mentioned, it's not just about what is evaluated, it's who commissions evaluation that is important for us. And how is the evaluation done? And we believe that there's the vast knowledge that is in the Global South, and vast experiences and theories and practices that should be brought to bear when we do evaluation. And even the paradigms that we use to evaluate should be questioned or to create evidence, to get evidence. We should be starting to think about the paradigms that we're using, and there should be a shift in those paradigms. And we need to acknowledge the knowledge, the realities, the practices. So what shapes the evidence or the credibility of the evidence that we call evidence and that we want to use as credible evidence? That too must change. And so what are the areas that are not being evaluated? What we feel is not being, can be changed, can be done differently, really, is the first thing is that very often I see that the effects of the intervention, when I talk about intervention, I talk about policy interventions, programs intervention, on the social fabric of the people that are experiencing the intervention is often not evaluated and often ignored. And therefore, we don't know the impact of that intervention on the social fabric. We talk about unintended impacts. We don't often want to talk about that. We don't often want to evaluate that. We don't also, when we come in as commissioners and as evaluators, we often say, oh, what are the standards or what are the values of the commissioners? What is it that they want to do? We also look at the values, and then obviously as an evaluator, I will also bring in my own value system. But we hardly ever want to understand the value system of those people that we are evaluating. For me, that has to change, and it is very important. And we talk about societal culture. We often go into places like tourists, zoom in and zoom out, without understanding the culture and the context. And so when we write our reports, we are like a tourist that says we saw magnificent Victoria Falls, and we leave. But we don't understand the hidden and things that are within that culture, within that society. And for me, I would like to call it the black box that you would never understand if you're coming from outside and zooming in and zooming out. And then issues around gender and equity issues are sometimes We do it because we are being asked to. And I can talk about, private investment, impact investment, and so forth. But I just want to zoom in on technology and innovation. And very often we are pushing technology so much, but we so often do not look at the unintended consequences of, technology. Yesterday I read a very interesting tweet, and that's where I want to end there. I can say a lot on this. It says technology. This was coming from the Michael Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore. It says technology has an unintended consequence. The 10% are getting smarter, whilst the bottom are being left behind. We need to make technology an equalizer. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you so much, Adeline, for those comments. I really think you gave us a tremendous amount to think about, and I appreciated the kind of specific calls to think about the community level or social impacts as well as the individual impacts, and really pay attention to unintended consequences that may only be kind of visible to people who have the tacit knowledge of the context. So I really appreciated those comments. Howard, let me turn to you. You have worked for so long on these questions and been such a contributor around impact evaluation and systematic reviews, and I think you have a kind of vision of where the field has been and where it's going or should go. So can I invite you to share that briefly,
sure.
And knowing that we can come back to you for any unanswered questions.
I'm going to come here because I want to show a couple of images are online in a moment. So I'm going to talk about what I call the evidence revolution that's taken place in the last 3 decades, and what I think can be the role for 3IE in that. So this evidence revolution has gone in 4 waves. So the first wave was the results agenda, or new public management, that took place back in the 1990s. This revolution is across both developed and developed countries. Campbell works in both developed and developing countries, so I see it happening across both policy spaces. In the development context, you had, for example, the Wappenhaus report in 1992 for the World Bank. It was something like the report of the Portfolio Management Task Force, as I'm its official name. And Wappenhaus recommended all World Bank projects should have key performance indicators at the outcome level. In 1996, a colleague of mine, Sonia Cavallo, and I did a review of World Bank projects and the reporting KPIs, this is the mid-90s, and we found that most World Bank projects at that time did not report outcome level indicators related to their projects. They reported, as Ruth mentioned, their spend and maybe some output level indicators. But during the 1990s, you did see, first in the US, in the Government Results Performance Act in 1993, in the UK, under the Modernising Government White Paper in 1999, a move towards reporting what they called results. But results were nothing more than outcome monitoring. And what we know is that monitoring outcomes doesn't tell you what difference your programs have made. So the General Accounting Office of the US, reviewing the results plans, the results frameworks of the different government agencies, wrote a letter to USAID in 2000 saying, thank you for your results report, but actually your results tell us nothing whatsoever about the impact of your programs, because you're just looking at outcome monitoring. So there's a realization by sort of 2000 or so, that outcome monitoring doesn't tell us what difference our programs are making. And that paved the way for the second wave of the evidence revolution, which was the rise of impact evaluations. So if you go to the 3IE database, and one of the main contributions of 3IE has been to have this database, which is the largest single repository of development impact evaluation reviews in the world, with nearly 5,000 impact evaluations and nearly 700 reviews in the database. If you look at the 3IE database, you'll see in the early 2000s, 40, 50 impact evaluations published a year, nearly all in health. By 2012, over 500 published a year. So a 10-fold increase in the number of impact evaluations being published each year. And you'll see that same growth in RCTs in social work in developed countries and education in developed countries and so on. So the second wave of the evidence revolution has been the growth of impact evaluation, particularly the growth of RCTs. And 3I is a very, very important part of that, not just in funding studies, but also in putting in place an infrastructure around transparency, replication, and so on. Okay, so you've got these growing bodies of evidence, and we want to learn from them. But we know, for reasons I haven't got time to go into here, we know you shouldn't learn from single studies. There are biases. There's what's called the early study effect, where the earliest study in a field finds a larger effect than the later studies of the same intervention. And different studies in different contexts might find different results. So you want to pull together the body of evidence and say, what does the body of evidence tell us? That paves the way for the third wave of the evidence revolution, which is the growth of systematic reviews. So again, go to 3i database. You'll see back in 2010, 2008, the year 3i started, around 20 reviews being published in a year, again, mostly in health. By 2016, it's over 100 reviews being published each year. So enormous growth. And 3i played a large part in that. In 2010, we put out a call for proposals for 60 reviews funded by DFID, AusAid as it then was, and 3i's own core resources. We ended up funding up 43 of that 60, but a massive push towards doing more systematic reviews that 3i was a very important part of. So that's the third wave, is this growth of evidence synthesis. Again, you see it in development, but you see it in other sectors as well. Okay, so we've done all this pulling together the bodies of evidence. Now we want to get the evidence into use. And the problem is, look at our deworming review, it's 700 pages long. Okay, so no policy maker is going to read that. Even our own mothers don't read that. So who's going to read that? So no one's going to read this stuff. So what do? So then you want to do knowledge brokering or knowledge translation, which is the fourth wave of the evidence revolution. It's where we are now. And this is something very different to dissemination done by research teams or dissemination done by an organisation like 3IE. This is where organisations have been set up whose job is to do knowledge brokering, knowledge translation. We're in the home of the main centre of knowledge brokering, which is the What's Works movement here in the UK. So this is why I want to show you a couple of images. So the first one is, this is not that one, that's someone's email. Sorry, Amy, putting your email up there. The first one is here, okay. So the first one is what I call, there you go. The first one is what I call the knowledge brokering platform pyramid. Too many words, need to drop one. And basically, this is how we summarise data into individual studies that get summarised in reviews. All of those studies go into databases like 3i database, and then we can make maps of those studies, which I'll come back to. And of course, as Manu mentioned already, 3i has been very instrumental in promoting use of maps. And then we have evidence portals, guidance and guidelines, and checklists. And I want to say a bit about the top three layers of this pyramid, because they are where the knowledge translation really comes in. As you move up this pyramid, the evidence is more heavily brokered, more heavily curated by someone to make it more usable by the intended end user. And what you do in the top three layers is you're reducing the agency on the part of a decision maker. So a knowledge portal, an evidence portal, and I'll show an example in a moment. A knowledge portal says, here's the evidence, you decide what to do. Guidance and guidelines, you have a group of experts look at the evidence from reviews and say, okay, here's what we recommend you do based on the evidence. And checklists say, don't think about it, just do this. There's evidence-based checklists, just do it like this. So there's less agency, more heavily brokered use of evidence. Let's look at one example of a portal. This is the Teaching and Learning Toolkit for the Education Down Foundation. It's the What Works Centre for Education here in England. And what they've done is identify 34 different types of intervention that you can carry out at a school level to improve learning outcomes. So they identified 34 areas like arts participation, and they've conducted systematic reviews of each, or commissioned systematic reviews of each of those 34. I won't go through all of it. The last column is the month's impact that you get from carrying out this intervention. That's in months additional learning a child gets if they're exposed to intervention. So carrying out arts participation, the top row, is like the child went to an extra 2 months of schooling. So we can sort by this, and we can see that giving a child feedback on their work, it's very low cost, I didn't go into that, it's very low cost, quite good evidence. It's like having an additional 8 months schooling. You can reverse sort and see that having a child repeat a year is very expensive and actually sets the child back by 4 months. It's a bad thing to do. Okay, so a study by the UK National Audit Office carried out 3 years ago, found that 64%, that's nearly 2/3, of school managers in the UK are using this toolkit to decide how to spend school resources. So 2/3 of school managers here in England are using systematic review evidence to spend school resources. This is the evidence revolution in practice, because the evidence has been broken in a way that makes it accessible and usable to policymakers, decision makers, to use it without going back to look at the original studies, because these top 3 layers of the pyramid do not require the user to go and look at academic research. They present the evidence in usable ways. So if we go back to the pyramid, this is what we should be doing. We should be creating this evidence architecture at every level, in every sector. Nutrition, child protection, agricultural extension, all of these, we need to have this evidence infrastructure in place so we could do a checklist for agricultural extension. Does the extension worker speak the same language as the farmers they're going to? If they're predominantly female farmers, is it a female extension worker? Is it the extension classes at a time and a place which actually farmers can make? These are things we learn from evaluations that need to be done, but it's repeatedly not done in our cultural extension programs. So we simply do a checklist of what needs to be in place. 30 seconds. So there's a role for 3IE, there are challenges for 3IE here and for Campbell. So evidence and gap maps, which was mentioned, something that came from 3IE. I was in Uganda in the summer and doing a presentation. I said, well, how many RCTs are there in Uganda? And people said, well, there might be 5 or 6. There are actually 92 RCTs from Uganda in the 3i database, 262 impact evaluations. So I did a bit of scoping. I said, let's look at process evaluations too. There are at least 600 evaluations of development programs in Uganda carried out since 2000. Now, evaluations of both accountability and lesson learning. But of those 600 evaluations, how many people know they even exist? Discoverability is 0, use is 0. So what we're proposing to do, working with the Prime Minister in Uganda, is do a country evidence and gap map of all the evaluations carried out in the last 18 years in Uganda, so people actually know they're there. So you know there have been 20 studies about cultural extension in Uganda. Let's look at those and learn something from them. So we've got to think about, every single researcher needs to think about, where do I fit in this evidence architecture? What can we do to build this architecture to ensure that the evidence we're collecting from evaluations is getting used, informing policy, and so improving lives? Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks, Howard. So let me turn back to, thank you again, Howard, for that. That was both inspiring and woke us all up. Let me turn back to the other panelists, maybe for just given the time for some comments and also any closing remarks. Adeline, you really challenged us to think about the power relations embedded in the who commissions the evidence, what it's about, how it's done. And, I'm still processing that and wondering, I'd love your perspective on this vision that Howard has put forth of how to sort of channel a particular kind of evidence into a platform that can be used to inform decision making. Any thoughts?
I think as Howard was presenting, he also responded to some of the challenges. The fact that how do we get that evidence used? Yes, it's been packaged in the different ways, but is this how the policymakers find it easy to use? Is it in a way that they find it easy to access and to use? Because unless if we are doing things that tickle us and we are happy about our own work, and it makes us have all these new creations, I think the bottom line is the use. How can we make it more user-friendly? And I was in a meeting with global parliamentarians in Colombo a few months ago, and one of the things they were saying is that, yes, we've been trained that we must use evidence for, to make our decisions. But the way the evidence is packaged, sometimes it's just so complicated. They don't understand how to use it. Sometimes it's not relevant to the policy that we're trying to discuss. And so I think it's the timing, it's the packaging, it's the relevance, and the relevance in terms of the other issues that I mentioned. So I think it's so very important. And I think also very often it's a top-down sort of, we expect them to just take what we've produced as evidence, and we don't also get their views to say, what would you like us to produce for you so you can use that evidence? And I think it's important. I know that you have not asked me for some of my last responses, but I just wanted to talk a bit more about some of the the minimum things that I think should be done as we generate evidence and do our evaluations and our research. I think at the very basic, it is so very important that we realize that within the African culture, for example, or the Southern global culture, we are relational, and it's important to understand those relationships that underpin everything that happens at that level. And so sometimes that defines who we are and our culture. And I always give an example of how the African culture is based on the Ubuntu, and the Ubuntu has various values, and one of those is relational. It's also we are communal, and we value spirituality, and there are many values that are related to Ubuntu. And if we don't bring them on board as we create our evidence, and we will be speaking to ourselves, and we continue to speak to ourselves. And I think it's a very basic, I spoke about using local evaluators, understanding the local culture, context, and also we must be aware of the social fabric, as I said earlier on, and make sure that we bring in the people to be partners in what we are doing. Whether we are creating evidence or we want them to use evidence, we must be making sure that they participate in the generation, in the use, and so there's ownership. That ownership is very important. And also just to mention that we need to go back and also ask, he mentioned the fact that in Uganda the evidence was there but the use was zero. We need to then go back and say why? Why is that evidence not being used? And go back to, to just review and back to the drawing board. It's important.
Well, I think we are in complete agreement about the importance of focusing on use, and your insights about sort of making sure that the way we think about it is well informed by the people who we're actually trying to support is really valuable. Alastair, comments from you either about how DFID could use a kind of platform like the one that Howard is talking about, or other comments about how to make sure that we are supportive of the use of all the knowledge that's being generated?
Yeah, well, perhaps I might frame it best as a sort of a response to Adeline a little bit as a one phrase that, as a researcher, the phrase zoom in and zoom out is always haunting of what one's behaviour has been. And I think one of the things as I've grown older is that my engagement with Southern colleagues has strengthened, and I value that from times in Malawi subsequently. And so one of the challenges is to have that sense, what leaves that view that this evidence is somehow otherworldly and is now having to be somehow pushed at consumers. And I think the Uganda example is a really interesting one, because the tragedy of that example is that there are not 96 Ugandan champions of that data, that rather than feeling how can we stir up the Ugandans to be aware of it, that there was sufficient partnership in the engagement in the work, that there's that sense to which it's not a push factor, but there's a pull to it. So DFID's engagement in terms of reflecting on its developing evaluation strategies through a new strategic impact evaluation fund and through a broader DIME program looking at refreshing our understanding of evaluation is very much to look at geographies, very much look at sort of sectors where there's a lack of evidence base. But I think this idea of ensuring, again, this is partly a DFID line, but also reflects my experience as an impact evaluator, that the quality of the evidence you get from that deep contextual knowledge, partnership, its local capacity, it's the agenda being shaped right from the beginning, the way those research questions are formulated, it so much influences subsequent use. that has to become part of it. So that's not to criticise this pyramid, but it's to see that the origins of that data has to be shared, rather in the sense that this is, yes, a global public good, but it's not a northern public good. It is a genuine global public good, that then we have a global mandate to then mine that most effectively. And I support very much that view of being more efficient in that sharing of that information.
Really, very, very thoughtful remarks. I see Howard itching to say something, so I will permit it briefly.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
So, I'm fully on board about the use of local researchers, and 3I made a requirement for the substantive engagement of local researchers in the studies we fund, and actually in some windows required, but the local research institution being the grant holder, not the developed country research institution. But one thing also we did in Uganda, where there's a government evaluation facility, where there are prioritised evaluations, we agreed very early on not to fund any evaluations in Uganda that were not part of the government evaluation facility. And moreover, we put together a funding package to support more evaluation under the facility, which was supported by DFID. And I went round with the Commissioner of the Monitoring and Evaluation from the Office of the Prime Minister to various donors to say, basically we want to put together a funding package, a port funding package for the government evaluation facility to coordinate evaluations being done in Uganda so they respond to the policy interests of Ugandan government and government agencies. And agency after agency said, we're going to use, do our own evaluations of our own programs. It's very depressing.
Well, I'm going to wrap up the panel. Does anybody have any last things that they really wanted to say and they didn't get a chance to?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, no. Anyone except for Howard?
And I think it is worth saying that currently within DFID there is a concern not only in spending money well, but the Secretary of State's line is, and that it could not be better spent. Now that can be seen as a threat, but it's a huge opportunity for the evaluation community to genuinely say that if we're to sustain the level of development spending with strong public support, then we have to show it works, that's what works, that really counts. And so although it's a challenge for us to show that quality of programming, I think it's a huge opportunity for this community to see that the development spend is taken very seriously, and the quality and the impact of that is very strong.
Great. Wow, that is a high bar that was put on decision making. Adeline, you have one more thing to say.
Just one last point from me. I would start by saying I have a dream. I have a dream that one day funders will fund Global South organizations and then ask them to get a partner from the Global North, rather than vice versa.
Well, let me just say we cannot completely fulfill your dream, but at the Hewlett Foundation, at the moment, but at the Hewlett Foundation a few months ago, we put out a request for proposals from research-oriented institutions in East and West Africa, who could, if they wished, invite a partner from the Global North to join them in advancing evidence-informed policymaking. So that was certainly a small attempt at fulfilling those, and those grants will be made next year. So in closing, I want to say a couple of things. One is that I think this panel set up the basis for many of the sessions to come, and particularly the next one, where we're going to hear the title of the session is Championing Evaluation and Evidence Use in Africa, and we're going to hear from people who actually do that within their own contexts, and I think that'll be very informative and build on this nicely. I just in closing want to recapture maybe a statement that Adeline made, that we want and need the evidence to be used to make a sustainable difference in the lives of people. And if we just continue to hold that in our minds and see that as the driving motivation for all that we do, I think that we will head in the right direction. So with that, I will close the panel, and I think Marie is going to tell us what's next, right? Thank you to our panelists.